As long as you live, live in love. Let nothing trouble you. Life is only too short, and time takes its toll. Hello, I'm Mike Hogue, and I will be talking today about the crisis of our age, a sort of crisis of reason, we could say. This is normally our first Church of Permaculture event, and today it's going to be a live event with probably just me. We were supposed to do this as a Facebook Live event, and that's something I've done before, but somehow it appears that Facebook has updated its information and that it's no longer available on my browser. So we switched over here to Zoom, and we'll see. It looks like some people are joining us, but I'm just going to go ahead and make this quick video, and we'll post it. It won't be a live video, but at least we'll have this content out there. We can start this discussion and continue it later. So I say the crisis of our age is a sort of crisis of reason. What I'm really talking about is if you look around at all the things that we tend to call problems in our society, well, at least virtually all of them, I think that they're all linked to this sort of internal crisis that we all seem to be at the cusp of in our current age. And the basic idea of it is a crisis of our faith in reason and the institutions of reason, particularly science and industrialism, to solve our problems and to continue to give us the kind of future that we want to have. The grand example of this is climate change. Climate change comes about because of our agricultural system, really scientific agriculture, and cars and modern industry, and all of these things of modern life we see are leading to climate change. They're leading to resource depletion. They're leading to ocean dead zones, and to all sorts of global growing inequality and oppression. So what happens with a lot of us is that we're looking at this and starting to wonder whether or not we should continue on with this path, or maybe reject it and go back and become hunter-gatherers, as some people say. And so what I find is that a lot of us who are doing this work of community transformation, landscape transformation, what we're doing is starting to reevaluate this relationship and trying to deal with and solve this crisis. And that's what gives a lot of us a lot in common. What I'm finding is that we can solve this crisis in ways that are positive or ways that are negative. And so to talk about this, we can look at this as a story of our time, a story of where we're at as a global civilization, for the most part. And we're going to be basing this on the tradition of Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, which we've talked a lot about. And oh, sorry, it looks like we have a few people joining. I'll let him in. Okay, we got some people here. Hello. Thanks for joining. I had some tech difficulties with setting this up today. It turns out that I can no longer use Facebook Live. It's something I've done before in the past, and it's no longer a functionality that's they're supporting on my operating system. So that didn't work. Uh, so I already have started discussing this topic, and feel free to chime in if you like about some of these things, and we can kind of talk about them as we go. But what I'd really like to talk about today is the crisis of our age, this sort of crisis of not of crisis of faith necessarily, a crisis of reason. And I feel that a lot of us who are in this sort of movement doing landscape transformation work and community transformation work, trying to transform the institutions of our society into ones that will be more just and sustainable, the systems that will carry us into the future instead of into sort of inevitable collapse. A lot of us are doing this work because we realize that the old systems that we've created, which were really systems that we've come to through the process of reason and through science, our scientific agriculture, and by the way, I'm just going to mute everyone. And when you want to speak up, please feel free to unmute yourself and do. I'll have a couple of questions in a minute. So all of these sorts of problems, like climate change and soil loss, the crisis of our food system, ocean dead zones, a lot of growing global inequality, and the struggles that we're seeing globally, all kind of stem from the idea that this path of reason essentially has led us to a point where it has created a lot of these problems and conflicts. So a lot of us in this movement are looking at those things and really starting to question them. And yet there's a lot of ways where a lot of us come from scientific backgrounds. So it's causing this sort of crisis of reason. How could it be that these institutions have led us to this place where we're fundamentally unsustainable and at the verge of global collapse? So it's a difficult problem for us to overcome. And a lot of us who are in this movement, that's exactly what we're doing, is we're trying to figure out how to overcome that crisis and move on. And I find that we can do this in positive ways or negative ways. And some of the tools that we'll use for that are based on the tradition of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and spiral dynamics that grew out of that. And in particular, there's a theory of Ken Wilber's on pre-rational, rational, and post-rational development that we've used a lot. And he's never quite used it in the way we're going to. We're going to use it to build some things and do some interesting things with, but it's an interesting model for understanding the story of our time. So that story, according to Wilber, is that we all as individuals, oh, and by the way, before we get into that, feel free to throw in the chat if you have any examples of the big sorts of problems that we have today that might be related to this kind of crisis. Just feel free to throw that in there. I'm going to continue on with this story, and then we can kind of chat together a little bit about what it all means. So, according to Wilber, this basic story that many of us go through as we develop our sort of bullshit detectors, as we develop our idea about how we know it's right in this world, how do we know it's true, is that we start with a pre-rational way of knowing things. And this can be very superstitious, and we think that perhaps there are gods up in the sky that create thunder and lightning, or that they create floods when they're angry with us. And when it comes down to knowing things, we tend to base this on trust, a leap of faith. So we tend to believe the people who are on our side, our in-group, right? And so it's a very in-group way of knowing what's right. We take the side of our people, our guys. We look at our politicians and we say, that's our politician. He's on our side. What he says is true. Those other bums over there, they're on the other side. What they say, that's all just a bunch of lies. At some point, Wilber says, we come to a crisis of faith. Those answers, our faith in our leaders, our faith in our religion, stops answering our questions well. Perhaps we start to wonder whether or not it's actually Zeus up there who's causing flooding because he's angry at us because of something we did, or is it maybe that the flooding is because we've removed all of the ecosystem and all the plants and things away from the river, and now it's flooding everywhere. So, oh, hello there, Kim. So this causes us to have this crisis of faith, and we start to wonder, how do we know then what's right? Maybe it occurs to us that sometimes our side isn't always being completely honest with us. Maybe sometimes those people are full of BS too. So we solve this crisis by coming to a place where we want evidence. We want evidence to know if something is true. We demand evidence. And this is the resolution of that crisis of faith for many of us, is we develop a rational worldview, which means we're demanding reason. And it's from this rational worldview that once we start demanding evidence, that we start accumulating science. The rational worldview is dominated by science and institutions of science. But according to Wilbur, at some point, that can cease to answer our questions well, too, for a couple of different reasons. Internally, as Carl Jung pointed out, it means that we've taken meaning out of the universe. Back in our pre-rational days, we did a lot of stupid stuff and had a lot of stupid ideas, but everything in the world had this meaning and vibrancy to it. And it was very fulfilling to us on an intuitive level. And once we abandon that, then the sky no longer speaks to us. The ecosystems are no longer filled with vibrant beings. And so this can leave our lives feeling kind of empty in some ways. So for some people, this is the personal sort of manifestation of the crisis. But the other thing is that in some cases, it starts to occur to us that pure reason, evidence alone, doesn't necessarily answer all of our questions well in terms of rational things about what is best to do as a community, as a family, as an individual. The evidence can be misleading, we say. For example, we may come to understand that when we're in this rational worldview and we're thinking only of science, we think that, like, well, what we need is just a computer to answer all of the questions for us and determine our politics. We can give it enough information. Science will tell us what is right. But at some point, we start to realize that the science of politics and political science is not about that there's a right, correct answer to everything. Conflict is natural to life. Conflict between individuals, conflict between groups and society. And there's no scientific right answer for solving those conflicts. It's about relationship. It's about other things that can help us answer those questions and determine how we make those decisions well. And that's actually what the science of political science tells us, that it's really about solving conflicts and deciding winners and losers and things like this. Science can't really answer that sort of question for us. It requires philosophy, it requires leaders, it requires individuals and sacrifice and all these other things. So at that point, we have a crisis of reason. And looking around today, as I started at the beginning of this, that's where many of us are at. We're looking around at the world that we have, and we're seeing that a lot of these institutions have brought us to a place where a lot of people are not happy with what the outcomes look like. And so we're coming to this point where many of us are thinking about rejecting that and moving completely back to the other way. And this is what happens when we hit the crisis of reason. We have really two options. We can go backwards into our pre-rational worldview and just make a leap of faith. We know that that didn't answer our questions either, but we just make a leap of faith and choose to believe in our leaders, our religion, whatever, and put aside our doubts. That comes with a lot of big problems. The other option is that we can jump forward and we can become trans-rational. This doesn't mean that we reject science. It means that we embrace 100% the ideas of reason and logic and evidence. And we continue to demand evidence for things that we say are true, 100%. So we're not rejecting that at all. But we're also coming back and embracing intuition and other ways of knowing, and the idea that sometimes the evidence can be misleading, and we can become skeptical of that too. So when we move up from there, we end up being able to apply evidence and reason to the questions that reason can answer. And we're no longer afraid of also embracing intuition and what it tells us, and relationship and philosophy and all of these other things as ways of knowing. And this is that trans-rational worldview. And what I find is that many of us in this movement are playing around at this little area right here, trying to figure out what this means to us and what it means to a movement where we're not rejecting science. We believe in science, and we also are reconnecting to things that give life meaning, and to an understanding that there are trade-offs and there are conflicts and all of these other things. And we're making much more sophisticated decisions than we could from a purely rational worldview. I'm going to stop right there in case anyone has thoughts or comments or anything to add to that, or pushback. So to give one example, and why this is really important to us in groups like permaculture, are that we've been talking a lot about things like white supremacy and frankly, fascism. And where you have a whole society that's at this point of a crisis of reason, and a lot of people are rejecting reason to go backwards into pre-rational ways of thinking, that makes us very vulnerable to rising fascism and rising in-group. I hate to use the word tribalism because it implies that tribes, like in indigenous societies, are somehow backwards, when in a lot of cases that's not true at all. But we tend to use this word sometimes to also mean having a strong allegiance to our people. Maybe a better word is the word that actual fascists use, which is like folkish philosophy. So this sort of we have this emergence of this folkish thing, because if you've rejected science, how do you know it's true anymore, right? If you've built this idea, and this is the danger that we're seeing in a lot of like permaculture, back to the land, eco communities, is people are looking at the science on medicine, they're looking at science on agriculture, and they're saying it's wrong. So those people are liars. The scientists, the science is a lie, it's wrong. And we have to come up with all sorts of conspiracy theories to say why those scientists are wrong. And once we've done that, and we've rejected reason, we've rejected evidence in favor of identity again, then the only way to know what is true, if we're rejecting evidence, is to just choose sides. These are our guys. It doesn't matter what the evidence says. They're right. They're telling me the truth because they're my guys, right? This leaves us vulnerable to manipulation and to a fascist worldview, and frankly, to things like white supremacy, because we're looking around at the people who look like us, the people in our communities, and we're saying, we're the ones who are right. We're the right. And so this can be a huge drawback, a huge problem there. So how do we transcend that and answer those questions in a way that doesn't make us vulnerable to that? And it's how we're always trying to move towards the idea that we embrace evidence and reason and science, but then we can also embrace other ways of dealing with that information. We can look at what philosophy says about it. We can look at drawbacks. We can look at it in terms of winners and losers. So a great example for all this is agriculture, which is one of the reasons why a lot of us who deal with gardening and farming and permaculture are all really placed right here at the center of this crisis. Because, of course, it's the green revolution technology, the revolution in modern farming based on fossil fuels and chemicals that has really built the modern world today. And we still have people who are out there who are saying, we're the scientists, we're the rational ones. We say that this whole set of technologies is 100% good. There's no problems with it. You have people saying, that there's no evidence that herbicides and pesticides have any damage to ecosystems or people when used according to the labeled use. Now, of course, at the same time, we have plenty of evidence that when they're not used according to the label, they do cause tons of damage to people and to ecosystems. And we also have tons of evidence in multiple studies on landscapers, on farmers, showing that in most cases, fewer than 40% of people who are professionals at their jobs of being herbicide and pesticide applicators actually follow those instructions. So we know that most people who are doing it, even on a professional level, are doing it wrong. And we have evidence that this thing is causing harm. And of course, there's a huge, robust scientific literature showing that this form of agriculture is destroying the soil, it's destroying ecosystems, it's driving mass extinction, it's the number one causer of climate change. So we know that. So here is that conflict really crystallized. We have this one thing, how we manage land, how we manage our food system. And we know that it's leading to all of these global consequences. And that's the rational system. That's the scientific form of agriculture. So when we look at something like permaculture, the reason why so many of us in this sort of movement are playing around with this trans-rational worldview and moving into this trans-rational space is because we could see permaculture as being 100% a response to this crisis, right? Permaculture is a response to that crisis in the food and how we manage landscapes. Permaculture is essentially a trans-rational critique of scientific agriculture. So permaculture itself at its best does represent that shift into that space. It's exactly what it is. It's like the kind of one way of defining permaculture is that it is a response to this crisis of reason in the realm of land management and food. So that's where a lot of us are. So what I'm really interested in then is what are those patterns? What are the things that help us move forwards to this trans-rational worldview where we still accept the science 100% and we're not creating bizarre conspiracy theories to say why the science is wrong. And yet we are still able to have an interesting discussion around these things and critique them from this trans-rational worldview in the same way that permaculture critiques scientific mainstream agriculture. And I've been talking on and on, so I just want to give a little space and see if anybody else on here has thoughts or ideas about this topic. Okay. So a few things. I was saying before that we really need to develop what we could call our, and here I'm going to see if I can do this. Boom. We have to develop our transcendent BS detector, because a lot of what we're talking about here is how do we tell in this modern weird world what is true and what isn't. And so understanding these stages that we move through, in the beginning, we have this pre-rational BS detector that tells us what's true in the world. And it's largely based on what my leaders tell me is the truth. Our decisions are made based on trust in our leaders, our peers, our group identities, our folk, as those fascists say. Once we hit this crisis of faith, once we start to wonder, well, hey, maybe those guys are sometimes not being completely honest to me, or sometimes, maybe Zeus isn't, maybe I don't know for real that Zeus is the reason why the river is flooding. We move up and we start to look for reasons why the river is flooding, reasons why the soil is no longer as productive as it was, and we develop science to solve that. Our decisions then are made based on reason and evidence. We have this rational BS detector. And so this is one of those things that's really interesting to think about. Once we have a crisis of reason, and that no longer solves our problem, we can move in one of these two directions. I really think at that point, this second stage is kind of like ephemeral, right? We don't just stay here forever. This second stage, we actually can fall out of it. And in fact, once we hit that crisis of reason, there starts to be a breakdown of the rational worldview, and we can't stay there anymore. It's gone. So we fall back necessarily into a pre-rational stage unless we move to the transcendent or transrationalism. So this is one of these, it's called, the pre-trans fallacy. But where people who can claim that they're on the science side may actually still be pre-rational. So because they've hit that crisis of faith or crisis of reason, they understand that the end point of reason there is no longer going to answer their questions. They're looking around, they're seeing climate change, they're seeing soil collapse, they're seeing all these problems. And so they have this crisis, right? So they can choose to go backwards and reject science, or they can choose to go backwards and make science their religion, right? So they can actually come to a place where they're like making a leap of faith. It doesn't matter what the evidence all around us, right? Because climate change, its existence is evidence. The issue of the pesticide and herbicide treadmill are evidence. They're choosing to reject evidence to make a leap of faith that the institutions and totems of science are right, because that's our side, that's our people, that's my thing, right? I'm on that side. So, but that's actually a pre-rational worldview too. So this second stage, I think, is ephemeral. I think most people don't last there. They either choose to reject it by going back to a religious worldview, or they reject it and go to a religion in science, a faith in science, a faith which we could call scientism. It's very anti-science, actually. Scientism, a religious faith in science, is completely anti-science. Which is why those people, you see them in a lot of like Facebook food groups and gardening groups, and they're actually rejecting all the science on ecology and stuff that shows that industrial agriculture causes problems, because that hurts their religion, right? That is not part of their dogma. That insults their religion, their religious belief in progress, scientific progress. So it's a hard thing to negotiate, to come into this third stage where we're kind of like questioning everything. Life becomes really complex, and there's no easy answers. The answers are complex and muddy and emotional, and not everything has to be efficient. We can make decisions based on what's good for relationships and things like that. So decisions in this stage are made with a sophisticated analysis and a healthy skepticism of evidence, leaders, groups, of everything. So this is a hard place to inhabit, and none of us are like in this spot at any one time. We could look at in any particular question that comes up, we might on some of them fall back to a pre-rational worldview or embrace this transcendent worldview. I think there's a directionality to our whole movement, which is we're trying to go towards this transcendent worldview. And the risk, the danger that we all face at this time is that we fall back into this pre-rational one. Now, another reason why I'm talking about this is it's related to gardening. Yes, a lot of the questions that we're asking in gardening groups are actually about this stuff too. You know, people ask about all sorts of questions in a gardening group, and you can have answers. People will give you answers from a pre-rational worldview, a rational worldview, or this transcendent worldview. So learning to recognize those is kind of important too. And really, the best gardening is going to come from this transcendent worldview. It's going to be the kind that isn't just based on a reductionist science, because from the pure stage 2 rational worldview stuff, you're maximizing productivity at all times. Well, you know what? We have a ton of great science that shows that can make landscapes and communities look boring. It can destroy community character and leads to all sorts of long-term problems. So the transcendent view is that we have to care about things like biodiversity and ecosystem character. And what does it feel like to us? Does it feel good? Does it make a beautiful environment? It's much more complex than just, what does the science say? We make a much more complex decision here. So that's going to give us the best answers for our gardening too. And there's another reason why I like to talk about this with gardening. It turns out that one of the biggest things that will help us move towards this trans-rational worldview, this transcendent worldview, is related to the breakdown of our disgust mechanism. One of the big things that correlates with the pre-rational worldview is a strong disgust response, researchers have found. So that, and this correlates very strongly with people who have this view where they're, focusing on their side and what their leaders say, and disgust ends up being used for that. How's that work? Like, we end up having disgust for the other, and that builds our in-group, right? So people in this pre-rational worldview are always trying to make us disgusted with other people, right? The way those other people over there look, the way they smell, the color of their skin, the way they are with their children, we describe them in ways that cause us disgust. And it's actually a physical thing for people who are still trapped in this kind of pre-rational worldview. And what that disgust does is it closes us off to compassion. And this is why in all of the world's wisdom traditions, there is a process or a method for helping us break down and deal with this disgust factor. We see that in Christianity, for example, even where, the stories about Jesus washing, hanging out with lepers and prostitutes, people that the pre-rational types would have considered unclean and disgusting, right? And here Jesus is washing their feet. And this breaks down that disgust and allows us to have compassion for those people, right? So disgust and compassion are on two different sides of things. And to me, when we get involved with our ecosystems directly, when we get involved with growing our own food, we are involved in a real way with breaking down the disgust mechanism. It's funny, a lot of people in our mainstream Western kind of society will come into a garden and you can tell where people are at on and people who have moved up into more compassionate realms, rational worldview or transrational worldview, they'll be out there picking cherry tomatoes and eating them, and picking greens and eating mint from the garden. And people who are still trapped in this pre-rational sort of worldview will be like, oh, there were bugs crawling on that. Ew. You can't eat food straight from nature. It's got bacteria on it and who knows what. And it's a very real disgust mechanism. Think about that. That is disgust for life itself. It closes us off from our compassion and our direct connection to nature itself. This is why I think, again, so many of us are at this cusp of moving into this transcendent sort of worldview, because we're doing a completely different sort of gardening. It's not about control. It's not about disgust. And control is often related to disgust too, right? If we're disgusted with those people and their behavior, then we want to control it so they're no longer doing it, because it causes, it's icky, right? In our gardens, we're creating a system that has a lot more natural balance. So, yeah, so that's really, those are some of the main points I really wanted to talk about. And this just sets us up, I guess, with a future discussion we can have about how we as a movement can continue to move in this direction of embracing both science and intuition, and have a holistic, beautiful, full view of life, as opposed to one that's just determined by faith or only by reason. So I hope we can continue to have that discussion together. Well, if anyone is still on and has any other thoughts or wants to add anything. And if not, I think that was a good, quick little video on this basic kind of topic today, and a decent overview. I'll kind of watch through it again, see if what I said made any sense, but hopefully, I hope we can continue this discussion, because I really do think this is the direction for our movement. This is the direction of the future. This is how we break down all of the problems that this crisis of reason are related to. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.